So Lankelly Chase Foundation is a grant-making organisation. Our core aim is to tackle severe and multiple disadvantage, which is the coming together of several social harms in the lives of individual people. So most obviously homelessness, drug misuse, offending, violence and abuse, mental illness, etc. So people who are on the real margins of society. And our job is to get out there, find the people who are doing the most inspirational stuff in that area, and back them to make a difference. And if there aren't any people, to instigate new action based on research and conversations and partnerships.
And so kind of another way of framing that question is which systems are you seeking to change, and what are you seeking to change in those systems?
The systems that typically affect highly marginalised people are either systems which were originally set up to help them, so mental health systems, social care, housing, homelessness, etc., or systems which are set up to contain them, most obviously the criminal justice system. And what we find with those is that those that are set up to help are typically not helping and are in fact exacerbating problems for people based on a number of reasons. And those which are designed to contain are doing a very poor job of that, largely because you can't contain people, you have to help them. And so they end up with kind of counterproductive outcomes.
And so within those two systems, the ones that are trying to help and the ones that are trying to contain, specifically what kinds of things are you looking to change within them?
The sorts of changes we're looking for are most obviously that people are at the centre of them, that the whole person is understood rather than chopped up into fragments through silo-based delivery, that people are treated as actual human beings who need agency and control and power in their lives, like the rest of us. So we want some kind of flicker of recognition of basic human psychology permeating them, and systems that don't also chunk people up into episodes as well, because we all need consistency, continuity, coherence in our lives, and typically people are having to manage really problematic transitions between systems along a journey.
And so that's the outline of what you do. What are the tactics that you use to make these changes happen?
Well, as a charitable foundation, we are generally asked to fund the consequences of failure. So charities who come to us to say, we've got a great idea that can paper over the cracks of poor systems. Our job now, as we're interpreting it, is to take those ideas, try and understand what it is about the wider system which is creating those cracks, and then the tactic would be to view the charity as, if you like, a positive deviant within the system, somebody who has understood the problems with the system, and rather than just view them as somebody who's soaking up failure and papering over cracks, we try and reinterpret their contribution as an agent of change. So that requires us to work much more intensively with them, to give them proper resource to be that agent of change, and to facilitate, broker platforms for them to exercise leadership.
And I know, like, as part of your work, you're thinking quite a lot about systems, and you're doing some influencing work, and you're also doing the work you've just described. And it'd be good to kind of just get a bit more detail on, like, all the different strategies that you're using to intervene.
Okay, so the core strategy, what with us being a grant maker, is to is to find the great people out there who are going to generate change within systems, who have the wherewithal to take systems on and find new solutions, to back them, to network them, and create some kind of movement for change, with those people as kind of nodal points within that movement. But that on its own isn't going to be enough. And we've consulted with those people and said, well, what's our role as a foundation beyond what we're doing with you? And the key thing that comes out of that is the need for a reframing of the language, the norms, the assumptions that surround or underpin systems. They need somebody who can join the dots, create a new narrative about what these systems are for, who they're for, on what terms, who decides, etc., and try and communicate that in a way that causes people to renew or to look again at their understanding of systems and stand in a different place in relation to them. And I suppose the third thing is that as a foundation with independent money, we can also help to redistribute power. And most obviously, power to people whose voices are much less heard or never heard within debates about systems. So most obviously, the people who use those systems or are on the receiving end of them. And so we have started to facilitate spaces where users of systems, decision makers, and providers can come together in a neutral space and understand each other's language, each other's priorities, and that can be quite transformational.
There's quite a lot I want to pick up on from that. It was really rich. So let's start with that last point, the kind of bringing together.
Yeah.
What are the important aspects of convening that make it successful? When you're designing that kind of meeting, what do you think about? How do you design it so that it will be meaningful for all the participants?
Okay. I would say that the heart of convening is relationships. So you can't just pluck a few people at random, bring them into a room, and hope that will work. Because convenings do require some kind of leadership and some element of trust to already be in place. So typically, if you're working with people from vulnerable backgrounds, you need to have started that conversation with them months in advance, so that by the time they're in that room, talking with people who are quite alien to them, using highfalutin jargon and are deemed to be sources of power, that they have had an opportunity to understand their own capability, strengths in relation to the issue, and have a degree of confidence. And in a similar kind of way, from the other end, those commissioners who are having to step out of busy lives, they need to see something that's in it for them. And so that is about them understanding that there's a conversation that's going to happen that they can take something out of back to their day jobs. And notably, the commissioners who we do manage to get in the room say, this is a kind of conversation I never get to have. Or if I have it, it's over an hour and a half in a user forum that we have commissioned, and they don't get to have prolonged, in-depth, non-hierarchical conversations. And that's the second bit about the convening, is they have to be non-hierarchical, that you have to have people who can engage with each other on their own terms. And so one obvious methodology for that is open space methodology, which allow everyone in the room in a highly democratic way to determine the agenda, to exert their own leadership, to lead discussions. And we're finding that users of services are just as likely to do that as decision makers.
And then going on to that point about narrative, can you talk a bit more about how you're going about that reframe or building of a new narrative? Not really. It's just something that
So the reframing of the narrative bit is something that we are just coming to as a realization that there are certain tactics that you can deploy on systems change, but ultimately we are all working within a frame of assumptions, decisions that were made historically that nobody can remember why they were made, and they have just become ossified as the way we do things now. And we are actually in the space of exploring what the methodologies would be of allowing us to turn some of that stuff on its head.
And you might have already kind of talked about it indirectly, but we're really interested to know whether you have a theory of change, and if you do, what that is.
Well, our theory of change is something that we put out there on our website, unusual for a UK grant maker, to say that we think that change is not just going to come from continuing the proliferation of services. Those services are telling us something about wider systems that aren't working, and that we need to understand why systems are treating good ideas almost like rejected organs. They're kind of the antibodies are pushing them out. So how do we create a space for an idea to express its full potential so that the system can mould itself around that? Whereas typically what has to happen with voluntary organisations is that they have to commodify their idea very early in the developmental process and flog it to a system which is reluctant to buy it. And guess what? That normally doesn't work. But our theory of change is morphing as it goes on. It's a kind of emergent theory of change because we are learning and iterating as we go forward, because this is a complex environment with many, many variables, and all sorts of stuff is cropping up all the time. So it's quite unlikely that the ideas that we had a year ago are the same ones that we've got now.
And that's a really interesting way of articulating it. So on the one hand, you have to be iterative in your theory of change, because as you learn more, that feeds back into your understanding of how change happens, and then that theory of change will be informing how you do what you do. Like, how do you manage that tension?
I think a theory of change that is iterative and emergent and learns as it goes along needs at the heart of it a set of principles that you can hold true to over time. So it needs some vision and leadership within it to say, these are the values and principles that we think should underpin a future system that works. Beyond that, you probably also need to continually evolve a shared language with a much wider set of stakeholders to ensure that that your ideas are out there in the real world and are being understood and shared by a much wider constituency. So it's a highly interactive, externally facing process. You can't kind of put your head down and engage in a controlled experiment away from the systems, the complex systems that you are working with. It's a continual process of two-way communication, and some of the effects of that are going to happen beyond the control of the organisation that is holding its theory of change.
And what's interesting about that approach is that most organisations don't do that because they fear that it makes them vulnerable to be so open about what they're questioning. And yet, ironically, it will make the work better and stronger to be like that. Is that a problem that you're having? Was that an easy decision to make, to be so open about your theory of change, or your strategies being iterative in that way?
Our journey towards a more emergent theory of change has been an evolving one, and in a sense we have appreciated the limitations of a more programmatic, controlled approach as we've gone along. But the challenge, you're right, is to ensure that we can continue to have clear governance, and that it doesn't descend and unravel into chaos. And I think the core of that is understanding that most of the difference you're going to make is through learning that loops back and loops back. So the role of governance in that context is to continually understand the evolution of that learning, and not be demanding tangible outcomes which might pervert or skew what you're trying to achieve. So that allows you to contend with the risk of failure, because that is just as likely to generate deep learning as successes are. And I don't know who said that the best way of understanding complex systems is to disrupt them. But that's a good way of capturing that success or failure in that context is less interesting than what an intervention, a bold action in that field tells you about the wider dynamics.
And so that point about learning links into something we're interested in, which is about theory and practice, and how you as an organisation integrate theory and practice quite practically, and then also how, and maybe it's actually a separate question, how you institutionalise your learning.
I didn't understand the bit about theory and practice.
So the first bit is, take systems change. There's lots of theory around that work. Take any of the sectors that you're working in, there's lots of theory about change, about what happens in that area.
I see.
And then there's the practical business of making change happen.
Yeah.
What's the interface between the two of them?
Yeah, good question. Okay. I can do this. The link between theory of practice and system change is a complex one, because the people who are engaged in practice and the people who are theorizing are very rarely the same people. And so, for example, we're really interested in the recovery movement that's going on in drugs, the recovery movement that's going on in mental health, the desistance movement that's going on in criminal justice, and homelessness doubtless has its own philosophy and movement. These are all ideas that are emerging about how change happens and what systems need to deliver them. They are multiple strategies, multiple philosophies, often describing exactly the same people. And then, on the other hand, you've got a bunch of organisations who are just trying to do good things with homeless, drug-addicted people. So the question is, how do you create a space where all of these lines can connect and people can start to create a bigger appreciation of the bigger game that they're playing here, that is both philosophically sound and has integrity, but is actually grounded in who people are. And I think that comes back to creating fora where things can be fused together and understood collectively by different players. The way that we have approached learning at Lankelly Chase is firstly to ensure that it's properly resourced. So most organisations who are trying to do something quite interesting on the margins of society have very, very little capacity to learn. They're just trying to survive. And one of the interesting things about system change is if the change is going to come from positive deviation on the margins, it's often going to come from people and organisations who lack resources. So if we want them to learn and we want them to capture that learning, then we have to fund their evaluation or a more interesting process of capturing knowledge. And foundations don't tend to be very good at backing that, and we made a commitment to do that, which means that we can't fund as many organisations, but I think it's worth it. And then there is a sense of, internally within Lankelly Chase, how we draw the multiple threads of that together and understand commonality of learning, so across different sectors and organisations. So we are engaging simultaneously with domestic violence organisations, women's organisations, homelessness, drugs, criminal justice, advice, you name it. And all of these all these silos have their own way of capturing and thinking about the learning of their practice. But actually, they're all wrestling with very, very similar issues. And so we're trying to kind of construct a broader common understanding of those issues across multiple fields, because we think that there is something deeper to be understood.
And how are you doing that?
Well, we're not at the moment, because that's the next stage of our strategy. So we've kind of funded all the evaluations, but they haven't generated, I'm only a year in.
Yeah.
So we think we haven't got any knowledge to learn yet.
It's really interesting. It's going to be really interesting to see what comes out of that.
Yeah.
Going back to vision, you talked about vision earlier on. How important do you think it is to articulate a vision of the future?
I think a vision is important, not necessarily to define the future, because that, for me, can often end up with some kind of motherhood and apple pie vision, which is not necessarily inspiring or realistic, because it just creates this unattainable nirvana. Far more interesting to extract a vision from the value of what people are doing right now. So asking a question about what would the world look like if everybody was doing it like this, or these kind of ideas were allowed to flourish because rather than despite of the system. So I think it's important to find ways of grounding it in people's current capacities and energy, rather than position it in a place that we're not.
Great answer. Working with lots of different organisations. So you work with lots of different organisations. You sometimes, I imagine, have to convene kind of multi-sector partnerships or types of collaboration.
Yeah.
Can you just talk a bit more about what you've learned, so kind of the key to those successful types of multi-sector collaborations, and perhaps some of the challenges that you still are finding difficult? So what works when you're convening or collaborating or building partnerships across sectors, and what is still tough?
Yeah. And so this is across, by sectors, do you mean public, voluntary, or?
No, I mean, I was thinking more, so,
more my silos,
yeah.
So I want to think about what works, but I know what doesn't work before I start answering.
We'll start with what doesn't work, and then you can do what works.
Well, the challenges of trying to convene partnership across multi-sector organisations is that they very often have quite different language and quite different conceptualizations of things. So a really obvious one is an understanding of risk. So the world that we occupy is structured on the whole, by and large, around risk management. Someone's drug problem, someone's offending problem, someone's mental illness, someone's homelessness are all understood in terms of their risk to others and to themselves, not in terms of who they are as people. And so you end up with systems driven by risk imperatives, which are different from system to system. And that makes it very difficult for people to literally understand who you're talking about, because they have conceptualized that person differently, and to understand resource allocation in that context, because risk management tends to organize resources, and so one person's priority is another person's low priority. So that's the challenge. The opportunity comes from looking at people. So you have to start with people, and that is obviously the core of system change, because people already cut through silos and are the radical disruption of leaden systems. So if you bring people together around case studies, and by which I mean not just who this person is right now, but who this person has been over 10 years, their journey through multiple systems, and or if in engagement with people using those multiple systems who do not define themselves in terms of systems, but in terms of who they are and what they want to achieve in their lives, then this forces people out of the comfort zones of the structures that they inhabit.
And I guess kind of practically as well, how do you manage successful partnerships, the kind that we've been talking about? Like, are there practical tactics that you have for doing that? And some of it might be quite intuitive.
I'd say that the key to successful collaboration is taking it very seriously, maintaining momentum, maintaining communication, ensuring that the relationship is looked after, that people are continually referring back to why they're in this, what they are bringing to the table, the common language that lies between people. So you have to tap into shared assumptions, because there will be all sorts of push and pull factors away from that. So, and the other challenge is, of course, that over time, collaborations get deprioritized within organizations. So what started off as an energetic, high-powered partnership between leaders becomes something that's handled at a much more junior level, where the partnership becomes much more transactional, because those people don't have the power to exercise initiative and speak for their organization. So you have to find ways of retaining the involvement of the people at the top, which means conscious strategies about what they are going to continue to get out of this, in terms of their personal objectives, development, or ambitions.
That's a really fantastic point, actually, about how those kinds of collaborations often descend over time.
Invariably.
Yeah. So we are wanting to try and make the world of systems change quite practical. And so one of the things we're asking everybody who comes in here is what they did last week.
Oh, good God.
Or it can be this week.
Oh, no, last week's good.
Week, yeah? Okay.
I remember last week.
So if you could just day by day go through what you did last week, just so that we get an idea. Yeah, Monday. Just so we get an idea of, what does it look like, a life of a systems changer?
Is that what I am?
You are a systems
Okay. Interesting. So last week, I'm afraid most of last week was spent preparing for my board meeting, which I had this week, which is interesting because what I had to do was come back to my trustees with experiences of our work out there and the change that we're trying to create, and try and distill that for them in a way that makes it real for them from a governance point of view. And so we were able to report back to them the inaugural residential of our new Promoting Change network and the learning that came out of that. And we as a foundation are in a process of trying to work out our strategy right now that will take us through the next 5 to 10 years. So it was trying to describe to them the complex, evolving landscape that we're in, and what a foundation as a change agent can do within that space, and what kind of roles we can take. And quite usefully, I had lots of feedback from our residential, from the charities that we fund, as the kind of things that they think foundations should do in this space. So that was helpful. And then at the end of the week, we had another 2-day residential, and this time this was with the Social Research Unit from Dartington, who we've been in partnership with, and they facilitated and convened a coming together of young people facing severe disadvantage, commissioners of children's services from local authorities, and a bunch of charities as well who are working with young people to try and forge some common propositions of how they wanted the system to change. So the young people got to see the imperatives and challenges facing commissioners, and commissioners got to spend time with the people who might be on the receiving end of their services and got to appreciate them as real, rounded human beings. And it was fascinating because the young people were able to articulate in plain English stuff which we wrestle with all the time. Shall I tell you what some of that was?
But first, I just want to go back because the way we're going to do this is we're actually going to draw a calendar of everyone.
Do you want me to do Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday?
I do want you to do Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. Just to
well,
give.
Monday I was in tears and thinking, how am I going to get through these papers?
Just to give an idea of, whether you were doing research or writing up, or and at the workshops, were you doing the convening or what were you doing? Because we're interested in the kind of the skills and the tasks on a daily basis of this.
The problem I have is that I just spend 3 days sitting writing papers.
But that's fine.
Is it?
Yeah. I mean, you can say it's.
I must have been doing more than
week.
that. What was I doing on Monday? Can I check my diary?
Yeah, absolutely. We've had quite a few people in here who just cannot remember the last week.
No, that. Do you? Hang on. Here we go. Right. Oh, interesting. Forgot I did that. Mainly it was cancelled appointments because I was having an essay crisis. Okay. So Monday. Right. Okay. So my last week,
yes.
On Monday, team meeting, connecting with different members of my team. They all have different roles. Some of them concentrate on research and learning, some on systems change, ideas and practice. We have someone who focuses on rights and equalities. So we've got different kinds of portfolios where we think different kinds of leverage are needed over the problem. So we come together as a team and share learning and experiences and try and extract common lessons. And in the evening that day, I spoke at an event on ethical investment, which is interesting in this context because we're obviously a foundation that invests, 120 million. So most of our money goes to corporates, global corporates, not to charities. And question there of, well, what kind of impact is that money having in the world? Is it good? Is it ethical? How does it link to our mission? And what can we do about that to ensure that our house is in order, but also that we are modelling change in the world? Because at the end of the day, we are where we are because of an accumulation of wealth, and yet we exist to reduce inequality, which is paradoxical. So how do you resolve that? The next day was spent writing board papers, and that was about distilling the learning for our trustees about the environment that we're in, our experience of convening organisations with very different ideas about change and trying to forge a network and an alliance that will make a difference in the world. Wednesday was doing the same, and but shifting there much more into what our strategy needs to be going forward, how an organisation like ours, which is shifting into a much more emergent, iterative strategy, can conceptualise that, govern it, and how that feeds into a coherent set of actions going forward, and how trustees can measure what success looks like for a change-making organisation, and how much risk appetite is there. And then Thursday, I went to Cumberland Lodge for a residential with disadvantaged young people who'd been there the day before, developing propositions on how they wanted the system to change, which they then put to a group of commissioners who arrived on day 2 with me and some charity leaders, who these commissioners then heard the propositions, wrestled with them, engaged with the young people, and then Friday was spent trying to co-produce and agree a kind of a set of proposals that Lankelly Chase itself will need to consider, but we're also hoping a much wider set of players will consider. And the great thing about that was the young people came away saying, gosh, I didn't know those commissioners actually cared. Interesting. And the commissioners went away saying, gosh, I didn't get to spend so much time with real young people, and I've got a new sense of the importance of my role and the energy that I'm going to bring to it in the future. So the ethical investment talk was Charity Finance Group, who have an interest in that. It was hosted at CCLA, who are the churches, charities and local authorities investment body, who are one of our fund managers and who have an extremely strong focus on ethical investment. But also at the table there was the chief executive of Share Action, whose role is to work with people like me to understand not only how do I screen out the nasties that I don't want in my investment portfolio, but how do I exercise my responsibility as an active shareholder to hold companies to account and try and shift their behaviours internally. And then there was also a guy there who was the investment director for the Church of England who was talking about their recent experience with Wonga. So it was fascinating.
Great. So we've talked about the kind of practicalities of like what life looks like over a week. We're curious about like what systems change feels like. What emotionally, how does this work? And if you could just talk in emotional language a bit about how you feel doing this work.
Brilliant question. I think system change evokes all sorts of feelings along the journey, and I think the reason why most of us like to work inside of a status quo is because even though we might find it frustrating and stifling, working outside of it is inherently scary and challenging. So for a foundation, we are lucky that, our daily bread does not depend upon our successfully engaging with the system. You know, the money will still come rolling in. So our emotions are less strong, I suppose, than they might be if we were grant dependent. But the feelings are often ones of deep frustration, then glimmers of possibility, then self-doubt, because none of the language matches what you're trying to express, and it connects with some quite deep-seated sense of inadequacy in the face of the enormity of the change that you're considering, trying to pull that back to a bite-sized chunk that becomes manageable within your resources and within your lifetime, then reacting against that, saying, no, I want to think much bigger, and I want to have a big systems change campaign that takes everything on. And so I think there is just for me, maybe it's just me, a continual process of expansion and retraction, which mirrors doubt and self-doubt and inspiration.
It's not just you. It's been very interesting. Everybody talks about frustration and the glimmers of inspiration and the enormity, kind of reconciling the enormity with what can be done practically, but that being a constant, a constant struggle internally. And so kind of following on from that, really, how do you sustain yourself in the work that you do?
Sustaining is quite easy because as somebody running a foundation, I get to do the nice thing, which is to give resources to extraordinary people to do the really hard bit, which is get out there and take systems on and try and shift them. So my sustaining comes from spending time with extraordinary people and feeding off their energy and their ideas, but also the excitement that comes from then trying to piece that together. But I think I'm learning that this thing called system change can become all-consuming, all-encompassing, and you can lose yourself in it, and you can lose your edge and your usefulness, because there are so many variables and so many connections that you're always thinking about it, and actually you can end up reproducing the problem that you're trying to solve, which is layering complexity onto complexity. And so you need to take time out to connect with simpler ways through. But basically, all the good ideas come from possibly some random thing that somebody has said that just sparks a thought in your head. And that spark is usually a very, very simple idea that might help you deal with a highly complex environment.
Okay, I think... Oh no, one more. We're looking for practical examples of systems change.
Yeah. Okay. How many do you want?
Just one.
Oh, favoritism. I mean, that's difficult for me. Yeah. Okay. So what, do you want me to start with my favourite example of systems change? So a really great practical example of systems change is happening just across the river in Wandsworth. Wandsworth Community Empowerment Network, tiny little charity that works with community leaders in Wandsworth to try and translate usually government initiatives into things which are actually going to make a difference to people in Wandsworth. And their insight is that the people who quite large swathes of the community trust are the people in the mosque, the temple, the black-led church, the black majority church, who they see every week and who they listen to. The people they don't listen to are system commissioners and representatives of local authorities. And what Wandsworth Community Empowerment Network has done is to bring those two things together to say, what would the government initiative look like if it was delivered on the terms of the community? So they have IAPT, improving access to psychological treatment, being delivered out of a mosque. They have got multi-systemic therapy being delivered by pastors out of black majority churches. And so they are embedding much needed evidence-based practice in the reality of the lives of the people that practice is trying to reach.
Wow, that's an amazing, amazing example.
It's good, isn't it?
Yeah, great project. Okay, I think that is the end of my questions. I guess a few more. So what haven't I asked? That's all right, this is from you. Like, what haven't I asked you that you think is interesting or important about systemic change?
And do I need to encompass the what you haven't asked me into my answer, or just the interesting thing about system? Okay. I think one of the interesting things about systems change is history, and understanding the historical roots of where some of our systems come from can be quite revelatory and transformational in terms of freeing you up to think that the system doesn't need to look like this. That at some point along the route, a decision was made that we have inherited that has, along with many other decisions, that have then ossified over time and have just become the way that we do things. So two things about that. One is, as I say, realising that it didn't have to be this way, that other choices were possible along the way, and that we don't have to just be passive recipients of history. But also that actually the systems come often from quite brave choices of people who were themselves system changers, and who might be quite horrified to think that we are now just accepting 30 years down the line the consequences of the decision that they fought for, and they would want us to keep challenging and exploring that.
Amen. So we're interested to know how you think what we're doing here could be valuable to you. What could we do with this kind of information that would make it useful for you?
Is this for you now, not the film?
Yeah.
It's interesting because I think this is I think people are increasingly talking about communities of system changes, which is which is potentially powerful. I have a concern always that we become just this wanky group of people who love to talk about this stuff. And also something that you started with, which is that thing about systems change is a kind of alienating, depersonal concept. And if we kind of club together and become system changers, it's just, well, firstly it sounds horrifically self-congratulatory, and but also it's over-egging the challenge. Only these kinds of people can do something about that. So on the one hand, I'm kind of thinking a community would be great. On the other hand, I can see a real problem with that.
And so I guess practically, what could we do that would mean that we were doing the former and not lapsing into the latter?
I suppose, the one thing that you can do, and it speaks to one of your last questions, is to bring together the practical examples. Because, people like me tart ourselves around talking about this stuff, but it's the people who are actually doing it who are the really inspiring ones. And so I know the people who I know, but my examples are limited, and they're limited to a certain sphere. And it would be interesting to see firsthand what can be gained, what's possible in other areas, and whether the methodologies are similar. I suppose the other question that you didn't ask is, does it take a particular, are system makers born or taught or whatever, and does it take a particular kind of person to try and change the system, or is it all our jobs to try and do that? And so that, so it's kind of meeting other system changes and seeing, is this just a kind of a blessed group of people, or are these just ordinary people trying to do extraordinary things? But some people are driven to it by extremity or necessity, and some people are just kind of, well, I don't know what drove Indy Johar, but he's just kind of this melting pot of ideas and creativity, and he was just always going to be like that, I guess. But it's kind of getting a sense of, I suppose I'm always wondering, where's the change going to come from, and who's it going to come from? And my board are quite concerned that we end up with a middle-class, elitist understanding of who the change makers are, and that we end up recreating middle-class paradigms because system change sounds like something that only highly educated middle-class people can do with, all the right jargon and all the right connections, whereas actually we could do with loads of examples of systems change which is rooted in real people's lives, in real communities, and showing the extraordinariness of people who've never heard of systems change actually doing it, rather than it becoming something that a metropolitan elite talk about.
It's really great. And so kind of coming on from that, what do you have other ways, what are the other ways you talk about systems change that aren't this kind of very elitist way? What other language do you use?
Well, systems change is a phrase that's come to cover a multitude of things which I think people would more readily identify with. So, I view user participation, co-production, co-design of services between people who are using them and people who are supplying them as systems change. I would see an awful lot of the service user platforms and groups and so forth as being highly instrumental in systems change. That's where mental health changes came from, was service user-led groups. So I think it's a kind of new term that's come along to describe a lot of things that people were doing already, a bit like Big Society. And but maybe it's happening because it's trying to say, no, but really the system actually really does need to change now, because we can't afford not to change, and we had loads of money before and we could afford the consequences of our own failure, and we can't afford that now. And so all these kind of small examples of people trying to change the system, they now need to become centre stage, rather than being these kind of bits that happen on the margin that sort of maybe ameliorated things a bit. We need these people to come right dead centre and tell us where are the new solutions going to come from that are going to help us to contend with the austerity and the scarcity that we're facing. So yeah.
I know we've gone on ages, but born or bred systems changes, what do you think?
I think it probably, I'd say that somebody is a systems changer if they have understood that the system isn't real, that we just have made it up, and that it doesn't have to be like this, that this is just a thing. You know, most of us relate to systems like they're actual things, that we have no choice but to work within this solid, tangible thing called the system, and that's our starting point. Whereas I think system changers are people who don't relate to it as real and tangible, but view the world as something that gets created ongoingly. And I guess that's a mindset that is by and large something that you grow up with, but I think people can also be knocked out of a mindset of acceptance into something more transformational, but it takes something to do that, but I do think that's possible.